April 1943, Mid-Atlantic, 1912 hours. The torpedo struck clean. From the U-boat's conning tower, the explosion unfolded exactly as the commander expected, an orange flash along the merchant ship's starboard side, followed by a deep, rolling detonation that split through steel like tearing cloth. A column of smoke rose fast against the fading sky. The convoy scattered instantly. Escort destroyers accelerated outward, unsure where the attack had originated. But the U-boat had fired from shadow, already slipping deeper as the torpedo found its mark. Through periscope optics, the commander watched the freighter list. Cargo spilled from ruptured hatches, lifeboats swung loose, flames climbed unevenly along the deckline. The ship's stern dipped slightly, then recovered as trapped air shifted inside its compartments. "Good hit," the first officer muttered. It looked fatal. Oil began spreading across the surface, dark, widening, reflective. Debris floated outward, shattered planking, torn canvas, splintered crates. The freighter's radio mast leaned at a sickening angle. Another internal detonation erupted, secondary cargo cooking off. The hull shuddered visibly. On the U-boat's chart table, the navigator marked the kill with a firm pencil stroke. Confirmed. Below deck, tension loosened slightly. Torpedo crew exchanged brief glances. One boat removed from convoy strength. A successful strike in open Atlantic. The commander kept watching. The merchant ship had slowed almost completely now. Smoke thickened. Flames crawled along the superstructure. No escort immediately closed to defend it. Destroyers were still searching outward, chasing the attack vector. The scene felt decisive. The freighter's bow dipped further. Water climbed across its forward deck. The angle increased gradually. Then it stopped. Not fully upright, but not collapsing either. The commander frowned. Ships sometimes linger before surrendering to gravity. Compartmentalization delays inevitability, but something about the angle suggested resistance rather than surrender. "Hydrophones," he ordered quietly. Below, the operator listened. At first, nothing but distant escort screws and background ocean noise. Then, faint, irregular, but unmistakable. A radio transmission. Weak, interrupted by static. Morse code. The hydrophone operator looked up sharply. Signal present, bearing same as target. On the surface, smoke still poured from the freighter's broken hull. Debris still drifted. Fire still burned. But somewhere within that damaged ship, a transmitter was alive. The U-boat crew had counted the wreckage. They had marked the sinking. Yet the signal would not die. And in the Atlantic of 1943, a living signal could be more dangerous than a sinking ship. Because while debris drifts quietly, radio waves travel fast. Inside the wounded freighter, the radio room was thick with smoke. The torpedo had struck forward of the engine spaces, tearing through cargo compartments, but missing the primary generator line by inches. Power flickered, wiring hung loose from shattered panels. The deck listed enough to tilt equipment against its mountings. But the transmitter still worked. The radio officer, face streaked with soot, keyed the emergency frequency manually. Sparks snapped as he forced current through compromised circuits. SS hit position. Static swallowed part of the message. He transmitted again. Short bursts. Repeated coordinates. Repeated identification. Not a long distress call. Just enough. Across the Atlantic airwaves, the signal flared weakly but clearly. It did not need strength, only clarity. One of the convoy's outer destroyers caught it first. The escort had been racing outward on a projected submarine bearing, chasing phantom contact. The sudden emergency transmission shifted everything. The damaged freighter was still alive. More importantly, it was still transmitting. The destroyer captain adjusted course immediately. Returned to convoy center, active sonar on approach. The earlier outward sweep reversed. Other escorts followed, the geometry of the hunt inverted. Below the surface, inside the U-boat, the hydrophone operator confirmed the change. Multiple screws turning inward. The commander felt the shift instantly. Moments ago, the escorts had been dispersing, expanding outward in search arcs. Now their propeller signatures were converging back toward the damaged ship. Toward him. The freighter's transmission had done more than signal survival. It had drawn the wolves back. On the surface, the wounded ship still burned unevenly. Its bow was lower now, but stabilized by internal bulkheads. Damage control teams had sealed forward compartments quickly enough to slow flooding. Fire crews battled flames with handheld hoses fed by emergency pumps. The ship was not safe, but it was not sinking fast enough. And every second, its transmitter remained active, increased danger below. The U-boat commander faced a narrow decision window. Fire a second torpedo to finish the kill, or withdraw before escorts sealed the perimeter. Another torpedo meant surfacing periscope depth again. Another firing solution, more exposure time. Withdrawal meant abandoning a confirmed target, something U-boat doctrine discouraged strongly. The radio signal crackled again through hydrophones. Jord. Persistent. Alive. Above, one destroyer reached effective sonar range and activated active ping. The first metallic pulse cut through the Atlantic water sharply. Inside the submarine, it landed like a physical strike. The escorts were no longer searching blind. They had a reference point. The signal that should have died had changed the tactical picture entirely. The crew had counted wreckage and oil. But wreckage does not guide destroyers. Signals do. And the signal was still speaking. The first sonar ping changed the air inside the submarine. It was no longer distant chaos. It was proximity. The commander raised the periscope carefully. Through wavering optics, he could still see the freighter, bow low, flames contained but persistent. The ship was wounded, not dying. And the radio mast still stood. Another transmission crackled faintly through the hull. The commander made the decision. Reload tube 1, prepare second shot. It was aggressive, risky, but leaving a crippled ship alive, especially one transmitting, meant inviting a coordinated counterattack. The torpedo crew worked fast, sweat mixed with oil in tight steel confines. The submarine held shallow depth longer than comfort allowed. Above, the destroyer closed. Active sonar pulses came faster now, echoing cleanly through water. The submarine's hull reflected clearly at this range. The destroyer captain did not yet know precise depth, but he knew the U-boat was nearby. Because the damaged ship's signal had narrowed the field. The U-boat's torpedo solution came together quickly. The freighter was barely moving. Range was short. Fire! The second torpedo surged from the tube. Seconds felt long at shallow depth. The impact came violently, another explosion along the wounded hull, this time closer to the engine spaces. Flames burst higher. The stern dropped abruptly. The angle increased sharply. This one looked terminal. But finishing the kill had cost minutes. Minutes inside a tightening sonar envelope. The destroyer adjusted immediately. Contact confirmed, bearing steady, prepare pattern. Inside the submarine, the hydrophone operator did not need to report it. The screws were close now. Very close. The commander ordered a rapid dive. Down angle 15 degrees, silent running. The submarine tilted steeply, descending hard. Loose equipment rattled. Crew braced as depth increased rapidly. Above, the first depth charges rolled. They detonated slightly aft, close enough to rattle steel and extinguish some internal lights, but not direct. The second pattern was tighter. The Atlantic no longer felt vast. It felt measured. Inside the freighter, the radio signal finally faltered. The second torpedo had shattered power lines. The transmission died mid-burst. But it had lived long enough. Long enough to recall escorts. Long enough to collapse distance. The U-boat had finished the target. Yet the signal's brief persistence had done something more dangerous. It had given the destroyers a center point. And now, as depth charges tightened with mathematical patience, the commander understood the cost of those extra minutes. The wreckage had been real. The sinking was now inevitable. But the signal that refused to die had changed the battle entirely. Because in the Atlantic of 1943, survival was not decided only by explosions, but by who transmitted last. By 1941 hours, the freighter's bow finally slipped beneath the Atlantic. Flames hissed out in black smoke and steam, debris scattered across all streaked water, lifeboats drifted. The ship was finished. But the battle was not. Because the signal it had transmitted lingered in destroyer plotting rooms like a fixed coordinate on a map. The escorts no longer searched for a submarine in open ocean. They searched around a point. Two destroyers converged first, approaching from opposite bearings. A third maintained wider arc to prevent lateral escape. Their coordination was quiet, procedural, disciplined. The U-boat descended rapidly, engines cutting to near-silent revolutions. The commander attempted a sharp bearing change beneath the chaos of sinking debris, hoping the turbulence would blur sonar returns. For a moment, it worked. The hydrophone operator reported distorted pings, slight confusion in echo quality. But escorts compensate. One destroyer held steady contact. The second widened its sweep to compensate for any deviation. The third reduced speed, waiting for the submarine to commit to a direction. They were not reacting emotionally. They were solving. The first tight pattern detonated off the submarine's port quarter. The blast forced men to grab rails as steel flexed violently. A gauge cracked. A small leak formed along a pipe seam. Still manageable. The commander angled deeper. But deeper meant less maneuver room. And battery life was already compromised from the prolonged periscope exposure during the second shot. Above, the destroyer captains understood something critical. The submarine had lingered too long finishing the freighter. That meant proximity. The radio signal had not merely confirmed survival. It had anchored pursuit. The next depth charge pattern arrived closer. Explosions overlapped. Sound became pressure. The hull groaned with sustained resonance rather than isolated shock. Inside the submarine, nerves tightened. The hydrophone operator whispered multiple screws, bearing shifting inward. The commander pictured it clearly, a tightening circle centered not on guesswork, but on a point drawn by Morse code minutes earlier. The freighter had died, but its final transmission had done its job. It had recalled protection. It had narrowed search arcs. It had erased distance. Another detonation slammed the stern section. Lights flickered violently before stabilizing in dim emergency glow. One crewman was thrown against a bulkhead. A compartment alarm chirped briefly before damage control suppressed it. The submarine was still intact, but the margin was shrinking. The escorts did not need perfect precision. They needed persistence. And persistence is easier when you know where to begin. The U-boat had countered wreckage. It had marked a sinking. But one signal, faint, damaged, stubborn, had redrawn the battlefield. And now, deep beneath drifting debris, the Atlantic felt less like open ocean, and more like a measured trap tightening around steel. By 20:05 hours, the Atlantic had turned methodical. The destroyers were no longer experimenting with wide patterns. They were refining depth brackets, walking explosions along projected escape vectors with disciplined patience. Sonar pings came at steady intervals, neither rushed nor hesitant. Inside the U-boat, air quality was deteriorating. The second torpedo attack had drained battery reserves more than expected. High-speed dive, sharp course changes, every maneuver now carried cost. The commander attempted a slow crawl beneath the wreckage field. Hopping debris and oil might distort sonar returns long enough to slip west. For several minutes, the echo weakened slightly, then strengthened again. One destroyer had shifted position preemptively, anticipating lateral movement beneath the sinking zone. The submarine's path intersected a pre-laid arc. The next depth charge pattern detonated almost directly overhead. The blast was different. Not distant concussion, but immediate violence. The hull flexed hard enough to extinguish interior lights entirely. Emergency lamps flickered to life in dull red glow. A seam along the forward compartment split enough to spray water in sharp, needle-like jets. Damage control teams slammed wedges into place while shouting over ringing ears. The submarine survived. But something intangible shifted. The crew understood that this was no blind hunt. The destroyers were not guessing depth randomly. They were adjusting in response to movement. And that movement had been forced by the decision to fire twice. The freighter's signal had narrowed the field. The second torpedo had collapsed it further. Now every explosion felt closer. Not because the ocean had shrunk, but because geometry had tightened. Above, destroyer captains rotated attack runs carefully, ensuring no single ship exhausted ammunition prematurely. They had time. The submarine did not. Persistence favored surface vessels. Steel below could only endure so long. The signal that wouldn't die had bought the escorts the only thing they needed. Position. And position, once secured, is difficult to surrender. By 20:32 hours, the destroyers had established overlapping arcs. One maintained constant sonar lock, another laid forward patterns along predicted ascent routes. A third lingered slightly outside the circle, insurance against breakout. The U-boat attempted its boldest maneuver yet. A sudden angled ascent, followed by a sharp rudder shift, intended to slip between two projected sweep paths. For a brief moment, sonar echo blurred. The commander felt it, an opening. Maintain course, quiet. But destroyer captains were not reacting seconds behind. They were updating in real time. The blurred echo had direction. That direction narrowed the field further. A tight pattern was released directly ahead of the submarine's surge. When the charges detonated, the shockwave slammed the hull with brutal clarity. Rivets groaned. A storage locker tore free and crashed across the compartment. A pressure gauge needle jittered wildly before stabilizing. This time, a crack formed along a ballast tank seam. Not catastrophic yet, but the crew felt the margin vanish. The submarine could dive deeper, but deeper meant greater stress. It could climb, but climbing meant exposing itself to lethal surface fire. The escorts had removed lateral options. The sea beneath felt vertical and finite. The freighter had long since disappeared beneath oil-slick water. But its final transmission had defined the circle. And that circle was now complete. By 21:00 hours, battery levels were critically low. Carbon dioxide levels rose steadily. The air felt heavy, metallic. Crew fatigue sharpened every sound into threat. Another depth charge pattern detonated close enough to rupture a minor fuel line. Diesel scent filled the compartment faintly. The commander calculated coldly. Remain submerged and risk hull failure or suffocation. Surface and face destroyer guns. He chose surface. Compressed air roared through ballast tanks. The submarine angled upward rapidly, slicing toward Fadding light above. The escorts detected the change instantly. Sonar echo rose. Contact ascending. When the U-boat broke the surface, gray Atlantic dusk greeted it, not empty water. 3 destroyers were already positioned within firing range. Guns trained. No panic. No confusion. Just readiness. The submarine had not been chased blindly. It had been shepherded upward. And all because one signal had lived long enough to anchor pursuit. The U-boat crew had counted wreckage. They had watched smoke and oil spread across the surface. They had marked a sinking in pencil and believed the moment complete. But the Atlantic in 1943 was not decided by sight alone. The freighter's faint transmission, short, damaged, stubborn, had done more than signal survival. It had drawn escorts back to a fixed point. It had erased the ocean's vastness. It had converted open water into geometry. The second torpedo sealed the freighter's fate. But the minutes required to fire it sealed the submarine. In modern convoy warfare, destruction is not always final when steel breaks. Sometimes it is final when radios fall silent. The signal that wouldn't die had lived long enough. Long enough to guide destroyers. Long enough to redraw the hunt. And long enough to prove that in the Atlantic, victory was measured not only by wreckage, but by who controlled the airwaves last.